So one thing I've really been trying to work out since India won that test match is what that actually means for the rest of the series. Because based on recent Bengaluru issues, you would have to say that there is a good precedent for winning a test by that much and then just going on to completely destroy everyone. Except for the fact that England did that to Pakistan around that same time and it didn't go as well for them. So the way I like to look at these things is by analysing it piece by piece, how the win actually came about and what bits are actually likely to stay or disappear. So on the left here, I have the biggest variables all the way through. Things that either happen in this test or are going to happen in the future and will have a big outcome. I'm not looking at things like Bumrah or Travis Head's form because I'm just assuming that that will continue. I'm more looking at things here that are just a little bit more variable at the moment or could have a huge impact if they go in either direction. Let's call this India versus Australia. Is this real? And that is why Nasser Hussain decided to bowl first at the Gabba. And this all, of course, reminds me of Hit Wicket, which is a mobile cricket strategy game that is all about making those tough decisions. Who do you want to send in as an opener when the asking rate is climbing? Do you go for the big hitter or the steady accumulator? Me, I like to throw in someone a little bit unorthodox. A bit of a wild card like the general that keeps the opposition guessing. And what about the bowling attack? Do you unleash your express pace early or hold back for the death overs? I'm always tempted to bring on a mystery spinner in the middle overs and just try and break a partnership. Hit Wicket puts you in the captain's chair. You draft the squad and select the batting order and even decide when to use those game-changing abilities. Do you burn your 2x ability to chase down a big total or save it for a critical moment later on? It's strategic, it's addictive, and it's more nerve-wracking than facing a Shoaib Akhtar bouncer. Give it a go. Download Hit Wicket and see if you've got the tactical nous to win. So you can see here, what I've basically done is I've got a column here for Australia and a column here for India. And then I've got all these different things that I think are going to play a major part in the series from here on in. So the first one is form. I think we know at the moment which team is in form and which team is not. But I assume that there is going to be a regression here, right? I expect Australia to be better at form in the rest of this series and India not so much. Only because India just won by 295 runs, and the idea that they're going to be able to do that consistently seems a little bit far-fetched for me. So there should be a natural regression between the two. This doesn't mean that India still can't boss this series, or that Australia's going to fly back and somehow win 4-1. But when you look at form from one test match, you have to be realistic and say that it would be almost impossible for India to keep playing at that level. And Australia were pretty poor. There were a few different reasons for that, but they were pretty poor. I would expect them to get a little bit better and them to be a little bit worse. I think that's probably fair. Team selection, though, is something I've been thinking about quite a lot because you look at India and they have all these players coming back. Rohit's going to come back. Shubman Gill's going to come back. They can pick Ashwin or Jadeja to upgrade their spin or change if they don't believe in Washington Sundar anymore. And of course, Mohammed Shami is, I don't know, he's bowling somewhere at the moment, but not quite in Australia. But eventually they can make it so he's bowling in Australia. Right? So there's absolutely no doubt that the Indian team can get a lot better. What about the Australian team? I mean, I'm not sure you could make a realistic argument that the Australian team is going to get considerably better than what it is at the moment. So Cameron Green's not going to come back, so that doesn't give them the little bit of extra bowling that they want, although they did get some overs out of Mitch Marsh. David Warner isn't going to come back, and he's also not going to come back in peak form, even if he did come back. So they're stuck with the opening hole, no matter how they look at it. And even if they don't think McSweeney is their person, they're not going to be able to bring in anyone with a huge skill level or incredible experience to just take over that position. Like, it's going to be another stopgap measure. The same if they have to move on from their number 3 as well. Like, this is more or less exactly the Australian team you would expect it to be. Maybe Scott Boland will come in later to rest one of the other seamers. But that's about it, right? Like, the Indian team can actually get better on paper. The Australian team has to get better, like, in form. The next thing I wanted to look at was the following test in Adelaide, which is, of course, a day-nighter. There is no doubt that this is a huge advantage to Australia, right? Like, can I double tick that? They are really good at day-night test matches, unless they played in the Gabba, apparently. But they're really good at Adelaide day-night test matches, and they've been quite brutal with the way that they've played teams all the way through. This comes at a very good period for them, having just lost that test, because it's their best chance of easily going 1-1. However, I think this is a small advantage for India as well, because if India came into this test 1-0 down, and you know you've got to go to Adelaide and you have to go through everything else, there is almost a fear that you have at that point, especially with what happened to India last time. Now, this is much more like a free hit for India. They can attack it, and if they lose, they're still 1-1, and they've basically turned it into a 3-test series from that point forward. So I think that's a big advantage to them. The other big advantage, I would say, for India in this particular one is that this is a bit more of a random test. And by that, I mean it's a low-scoring test. We know that the average day-night test is more like around 24, 25 runs per wicket, where it's obviously far higher than that for red ball games. When you have something that's a little bit more random, that usually helps the touring team rather than anyone else, right? Because now the volatility's up. The Adelaide match is a volatile test match. Like, for instance, maybe one spell from Jasprit Bumrah could have a much bigger impact than it would in a more standard kind of test match. So from that point of view, I think both teams are pretty happy going into it, if we're being honest. And Virat Kohli, I find this one fascinating because there must be an element of the Australian bowlers who think to themselves that on these wickets, they just don't have the ability to consistently keep Kohli down. So coming into this series, that would have been a tick for Australia because at the very least they would have said, well, he's not in form, he's not all that confident, we have a good chance. Whereas at the moment, you would have to say that even if you knew nothing else, you'd much rather be in India's situation to know that he's at least done this once, and so now Australia are going to fixate on him a little bit more. And also, he looks really good, right? It's probably more likely that this is a question mark because is this just one good innings? It wasn't under the most pressure in the game, although there was a bit of a mini collapse happening at the other end. He got some of the best batting conditions in the game as well. Well, I'd much rather be in India's situation right now, where at least they're thinking he can do it, and Australia's sitting on the other side going, oh, not this again. Now we come to the Australian top three, and I'm just going to put an X there to start with. That's probably unfair. Maybe it should be like a half X or something. I'm not really sure how to put this on here. There's an element where I would say that I don't think the Australian top three can be any worse in the rest of the series than they've been in that first test. But I'm also not sure that there is any cause for optimism for the Australian top three. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, Marnus probably has to be dropped the way that he's looking at the moment. And it doesn't look like McSweeney is going to handle Jasprit Bumrah very well. And he just didn't look like he was an opener. And it's probably because he's not an opener. So you're asking someone who's not an opener to open in a series where you're going up against one of the best bowlers of all time, who also got some helpful conditions against him. There's not a lot of things going in McSweeney's direction here. On top of that, as I said before the series, Usman Khawaja's been in a bit of a form dip as well. It hasn't been as noticeable because no one else in Australia is making runs and there are far bigger questions. But that means that all top three players at the moment don't look in form. I would assume that Usman Khawaja is the tick here, whereas McSweeney and Marnus are more of the X, if that makes sense. So how does that go from an Indian perspective? Well, obviously it's a huge advantage because Bumrah is currently bowling like he is a combination between Sydney Barnes and Glenn McGrath. Like, they're getting everything out of him, and it means this top three is going to have to go up against the world's best bowler. But I'm going to double tick this. And the reason I'm going to double tick this is because Mohammed Shami will probably come back, and he's a beautiful new ball bowler, and he's going to be going up against this again. So I think this is a real advantage for India so far. So the next thing on our list is Mohammed Siraj. And I just heard like a bunch of Indians inhale violently, right? Just at the thought of Mohammed Siraj. He bowled beautifully in that last test match. And there are a lot of Indian fans who will assume that means he will bowl poorly in the next one. I'm not just putting that there for the Indian fans. I'm putting that there because that is kind of how his rhythm goes, right? He comes to a period where he understands what he's doing. He runs through the crease and everything flows beautifully. And then it stops. I kind of, for him, would have preferred this to be a back-to-back test. Unless he gets tired or injured, he's much more likely to continue that flow. This is actually a weirdly long gap between the two, and I don't assume he's going to bowl a lot in Canberra. I won't give that as a tick to the Australian team here. And the reason I won't is there is also another possibility that if Mohammed Shami does come back, that Siraj becomes the third seamer. And if he's the third seamer, I would almost turn this into a tick at that point. If he's the second seamer, I'm a little bit more on the Australian side of this because I do think when he's the second seamer and he has to be consistent, that causes a lot of issues. If you have Mohammed Shami and Bumrah and perhaps someone like Nitesh ready to bowl some other overs or whoever it may be and some good spin options, Siraj is a wild card and can do absolutely anything. And if he has a bad test or two, they can always replace him. They have other seamers available to him. If he's the second seamer, then a lot of weight is put on him and you might even find a situation where Bumrah ends up being overbowled. So I'm not quite sure. I'm very confused of where Siraj can go. I thought he bowled really well on that first test, but I need to see it 2 tests in a row before I'd fully go in. Next, we have Jaiswal. I find this fascinating because I thought he was absolutely brilliant. But a part of the reason that he batted so well is that when he was going, the sideways movement on the pitch had obviously eased off. You could say that he played a big part in that because he batted well early on. I've got no problems with that. But I'm not 100% sure he'll be able to do that consistently, especially because this next test is in Adelaide and we expect a little bit more movement. Or not even that we expect more movement, we just know that movement in the day-night test is harder to play than it is with the red ball. I'm much more confident with Jaiswal kind of throughout this series. So I wouldn't do an X here. I'd probably do more of a question mark for him, for India for the next. He's about to come and play day-night test cricket in his next game. So I'd have to say, at the very least, it's a tiny tick in Australia's favour, just because they're going to be making him do things that he hasn't done a lot. He's so good, it may not matter. But it is a slight advantage for Australia to, I think, for the next test to be in Adelaide under lights. In fact, just thinking about that, if the Adelaide test wasn't under lights and was just a day game, I probably wouldn't be giving a tick there at all. I think it's legitimately just the circumstances and because he hasn't played as much cricket as everyone else. Patrick Cummins. I've been thinking about this a lot. If you came to one of the videos we did beforehand, I said that I felt that Cummins wasn't quite the force he had been over the last couple of years. There's definitely, he's gone from being, you know, a destroyer of worlds to a very, very good bowler, you know, and he's still incredible. I don't think he's dropped off or anything like that. He just isn't the force that he had been before. This first test, he wasn't very good. In fact, in the first innings, he was outbowled by Mitch Marsh, right? I really believe he was well below his best, not just a little bit. He seemed to be struggling for me with length and everything else. Here's the thing though, I think he's probably going to be better for the run. How much better is a question I wouldn't possibly be able to answer. Is he going to struggle later on in a long series? Also very possible. But I do think in what will usually be a short test, it might be even shorter with the amount of rain we've had recently, but I do think in a short test, under lights, against the Indians, with the pink ball in hand, with everything that's happened before, I think he's going to be a plus. So I have to put that down as a negative for India. As the series goes on, that might be something that might swing back a little bit. But certainly in the short term, I'm going Cummins. I think that's probably fair. Now, Mitchell Starc. This is an interesting one because I think a lot of people who've been to the channel a lot will know that over the last few years, I think Mitchell Starc has struggled quite a bit in Test cricket. I think he's struggled quite a bit in white ball cricket, right? And I'm one of those people who've been saying for a long time that he's one of the greatest of all time in white ball cricket. But he's not been bowling like that quite a lot of recent times. Like, it has changed, yeah? And in this last test match, he didn't take a lot of wickets, despite the fact that I thought he bowled quite well. And so this is my confusion. Does that mean that that's the one good start game? Or do I trust the fact that he just looks like he's in better form and better rhythm at the moment, and he seems a lot more confident? We saw him against Pakistan in the Shield game. He just looks like a better bowler to me. So this is almost completely on gut feel, because when I look at the numbers from the last test, they weren't actually that great. But if you look at the fact he was swinging the ball and seaming the ball, and those have been some of the problems he's had for a while. And then on top of that, it just looked like he had that little bit of extra zip that he hasn't had. Sometimes when you watch Mitchell Starc, there's almost a flatness to his delivery, even though he's really tall and really fast. It doesn't always come off that way. I felt in the last test match like he should have got more wickets and that he was in rhythm. I'm going to have to go plus here. And of course, I'm going to go double plus because he's going to Adelaide for the day-night test match, and that is what he lives for. That should be a negative for India, in part because I think India actually play him quite well, and they would have been quite comfortable coming in this series against him. And he's upskilled himself a little bit. And it might not have showed in the results in the first test. I kind of feel like we're going to see it throughout the rest of the series. Or I'm horribly wrong and I should never have double ticked. Sometimes you just shouldn't double tick. And here you have the conditions, and let's just put the tick in there. I think that's an easy one to go with, right? In the last test match, India got the best of the conditions. I'm not saying that is the sole reason they won, because I think on day one, it's kind of fairly similar with the conditions. If anything, the conditions might have slightly favoured Australia and India still blitzed them. But because of Alex Carey going out early on day two, it meant that the Indian batters had control of the pitch when it was actually at its best for batting for 3 or 4 sessions. By the time Australia got back out there, it was dark and it was shadows and McSweeney had to open, and it all went horribly wrong. So you would assume there's going to be a bit of a leveling off with that sort of thing, because that last test was so extreme. Remember, the Perth curator was trying to make it into a better batting surface and somehow managed to make it into a much worse batting surface, and then it still did exactly what it normally does anyway and cracked open. The only thing that would make it a little bit more of a question mark for me will be if it just rains non-stop between now and that first test. And that means whoever wins the toss could be in a great situation. And obviously weather and the pink ball and the darkness and all these things might make it a bit more of a question mark. But as we sit here at the moment, you would have to say that there should be at least a more level playing field when it comes to the conditions in the next game. And then finally, we have Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. These are all different pitches and I don't want to completely lump them in, right? But I do think if Australia was looking at this series coming in and they had a test in Perth and then they had the day-night one in Adelaide, I think they would have said to themselves, we should be 2-0 up, especially considering India's injuries, India's form against New Zealand and everything else. So I would say that all things considered, for the rest of the series, India should be the more happy because Melbourne and Brisbane are obviously still going to favour Australia and Sydney, of course, might favour India a little bit. But I don't think these are going to be the extreme conditions that we saw in Perth or the day-night conditions that we saw in Adelaide. Like if you look at the test series from last time, it was kind of in these 3 test matches when India did their work, right? That was when they played quite well. So that doesn't mean it's going to happen again because the pitches have changed and that was a few years ago and everything else. But I think if you just look at it from completely independent eyes, you would probably have Australia marked down as favourite for Perth and Adelaide, but you would bring in India's price for the last 3 test matches. Now, if they can get there at 2-0, then this means who knows what can happen. But if it's 1-1, they still have a huge chance because of where these test matches are playing. So this mathematical equation, or whatever the hell this is that I've made here, I think what it tells us is there's plenty of chances for India to continue the way they have been playing and maybe not dominate, but at the very least give themselves a huge chance of keeping this series open as long as possible, which means that even when you get the bit of the hometown boost and things start to go Australia's way, which will happen at least at one stage in this series, which means that India is still going to be in the series. Like winning 1-0 at the first test doesn't mean everything because obviously England did that recently and still got pumped. But Australia doesn't have a lot of great come-from-behind victories in Test series cricket, so it's a good place to be. And I think there's more than enough positives here that if you're an Indian fan, you're like, this should not be a one-off, or at the very least, we should be in a position where we can win again. But also, if you're Australia, I don't think this is absolutely terrible and it doesn't wipe you out of this series so far. The Adelaide Test coming at this point could not be better timed. And that's obviously a huge part of why I think there could be a swing back to Australia at all. But also in the last test, they had 3 fast bowlers in it, and essentially Hazelwood was the only one who really stood up. Even if I'm wrong about this, there should be a small bump to at least one of these guys in the next test, and Australia having 1 extra bowler with Hazelwood at the moment would be a huge addition. There are obviously many other factors I haven't even looked at, and others I have looked at, but I haven't put on the board for many different reasons. But the truth is that this is an incredible test series because I think there are a lot of unanswered questions and there are a lot of different ways it can go from here. And when you've been covering test cricket for 17 years like I have, and you quite often have to devote like 6, 7, 8 weeks of your life to this one thing, what you absolutely desperately need is to not know at all what is going to happen next. And I look at my ticks and I look at my crosses, but I also see quite a few question marks. And the truth is that right at the moment, we're at the very best possible place for this test series because there are so many different ways it can go. And if nothing else, that is an absolutely great place to start a 5-test series. 4 to go.